So welcome to this week's Optimum Health Clinic Facebook Live. And this week I wanted to pick up on the series around psychology subtypes. And specifically I wanted to talk about the trauma subtype. And talking about the trauma subtype, I'm also just more broadly talking about the role of, and I don't necessarily mean physical trauma, although it could be, but I mean specifically more mental and emotional trauma, and that the impact that can have in ME chronic fatigue, and also some of the ways that we can address it and work with it. So whenever we talk about trauma, it's an interesting one, because people tend to associate trauma as being the kind of what we call big T trauma, like big significant events that have happened in life, which anyone would say, yes, I recognize that as trauma. So something like being physically or sexually abused, for example, or being in a war zone, or going through bankruptcy, or something which is significantly impactful in our life that we can kind of step back and go, that's trauma. And that's true, of course, that's trauma. And there's what we call small t trauma, or what can otherwise be called developmental trauma. And this can be in adult life. It can certainly be meeting situations which perhaps it was a series of lots of small things that had a traumatizing impact, or indeed it can be not being in situations where we don't really have the resources at that time to meet the situation. Particularly also developmental trauma, referring to when we're a child, and it might not be that we experience kind of major physical or emotional or sexual abuse or whatever, but by nature of our parents being imperfect human beings, i.e. as we all are, and perhaps not being as skilled as they might be in terms of meeting our needs, that we find ourselves in situations where we just don't quite get the emotional holding and support that we need. It's almost like perhaps we went through a time where we were feeling very sensitive and delicate, and the way that was responded to was being judged or criticized for that, as opposed to being held and nurtured and supported in that. And so these kinds of traumas can have all kinds of impacts and all kinds of effects, both in terms of shaping our personality and our kind of the way we see the world and the kind of the lens through which we perceive life, but also can have a big impact in our body. So one of the ways that we tend to talk about pain, for example, is obviously there are many things that can cause pain. Pain can be caused by physical injury, it can be caused by nutritional deficiency, and one of the factors that causes pain can be undigested emotion. It's almost like we've not processed something on an emotional level, and therefore it tends to manifest in a physical way. And so there's some fascinating work around back pain. A guy who died recently in America called John Sarno wrote a book called Healing Back Pain that has been credited by a number of very famous people, including I think Howard Stern said he lends his career to the fact that his back pain was healed by using this book. And part of what that book talks about is that if we're not expressing emotion and feeling, that it tends to manifest as physical pain. So that's another way that this can be relevant in terms of ME chronic fatigue fibromyalgia, and also the maladaptive stress response, which is a whole other thing which we've talked about in other videos, often can be triggered by having trauma in the body which causes our nervous system to go into a state of hyper-alert, or effectively our nervous system to feel that we're not safe, and so it goes into fight, flight or freeze as a way of protecting us and keeping us safe. Put another way, when it doesn't feel safe in our body, we escape into our mind. So it's a kind of fascinating thing that when there's a lot of trauma or a lot of difficult feelings, or we don't feel safe feeling our feelings, or we don't feel equipped to feel our feelings, the way we cope with that, or the way we deal with that, is we go to our mind as a safe place. The trouble is the way that we perpetuate that being in our mind is by having this kind of constant background thinking and anxiety as a way to lift ourselves out of feeling our feelings. The trouble then is it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. The more we're in our mind, the more we're trying to escape the trauma or the feelings in our body, the more depleted we get, the more our body doesn't feel like a place that we want to be. The trouble is, the more we try and find a feeling of safety in our minds, the more we escape from our body, and ultimately the healing of the trauma has to happen by being in our body, but also the sense of holding and safety and kind of nourishment that we're looking for exists in our body as well. To be able to land and be grounded in our body, often we need to have some tools to digest and metabolize the trauma. I use the words metabolize very deliberately. An analogy that can be helpful, it's almost like if we eat a meal and we don't digest and we don't metabolize that meal, it would just sit there, and we'll feel kind of uncomfortable and heavy and slightly nauseous, and it will just be kind of sat there until it works its way down through our digestive system and we digest and we metabolize that food. And same thing is true with trauma, that if we don't process it, if we don't digest it, it tends to sit there in our body, and that leads to things like what I was talking about before in terms of can lead to physical pain, can lead to maladaptive stress response. It can also just be a driver of a constant state of feeling anxious and not feeling safe because we're trying to inhabit our mind as a way of escaping the feelings that are happening there in our body. Now, there's a lot that we can do psychologically and emotionally with self-awareness and working with ourselves. And sometimes just talking about these kind of things in this sort of way gives us enough self-awareness to be able to see what's happening and to then to be able to use that to start to work with it. And I would say that when it comes to trauma, often that's an example of something where having some outside assistance can be very useful. Sometimes we need the grounding of being sat with somebody else that is in a kind of solid, kind of grounded place that gives us the sense, which was like we borrow from their sense of safety and groundedness to allow us to be able to feel the feelings and process what's there. A few comments in terms of the kind of psychotherapeutic work that can help with this sort of thing, and this is a whole big topic on its own, but just a couple of signposts. I'm generally not of the school of thought that to digest our kind of psycho-emotional material, we have to re-experience all of our psycho-emotional material. In fact, some of the psychotherapeutic approaches that get used, I would say, are just re-traumatizing people by them reliving and having to re-experience the trauma. The kind of theoretical framework being, if you relive it enough times, you'll manage to digest it. And I remain unconvinced that's the way that way actually works. There can be places for it. Things like EFT, emotional freedom technique, working with a skilled practitioner can be a fantastic way to work with trauma. I wouldn't recommend working with significant trauma without working with a practitioner. Working on smaller issues I think is fine with oneself. EMDR, eye motion desensitizing and repatterning, is another technique that needs to be with a licensed practitioner. In instances of more severe trauma, that can definitely be appropriate and have a place. Good talking therapies can be helpful. Some of the tools from NLP can be helpful. One of the things that I found extremely helpful with people is looking at how they are relating to their own emotional life now. One of the things that people often are doing is they've internalized the way that their parents met their emotional life, and that's now how they meet their own emotional life. And so if their parents have been dismissive of their feelings, they've learned to dismiss their own feelings. So by learning to give more space to our own emotions and feelings now, that has its own healing impact. It's almost like we're becoming the parent for our feelings, at least now in our life, that we needed someone else to be in the past. So the more that we can do that, that can also just almost literally as simple, although I think it can need some guidance as well, but as simple as noticing what we're feeling, noticing how we are reacting to that feeling, and then practicing making more space to allow that feeling. So, as I say, this whole area of trauma is a big one. I'm trying to keep these videos to a kind of succinct 10 minutes or so. Just to kind of recap the kind of key points, recognizing you don't have to have had significant major traumatic events to have trauma. We tend to deal with trauma by escaping our body to go into our mind, learning to calm some of those thought patterns, digest and metabolize some of that stuff in our body, and EFT and forms of psychotherapy and sometimes EMDR, they can be things to help us with that process. But also just becoming aware can be really helpful. And how you meet your own feelings is determining whether the things that happen in your life now are things that cause more undigested material effectively. So I hope that's been useful. I'm just going to quickly look at the questions. So yeah, Michelle saying all my problems, pain and mental started with trauma. Is it true, Port's asking, is it true about emotional pain coming out of physical pain? I think it's true in some instances. I certainly wouldn't say all physical pain is emotional pain, but I think in some instances it can be, and certainly people's experiences seem to represent that. Jenny says, it's interesting that you tap about fight, flight, freeze. Most people don't talk about fight or flight. I fought and then froze for many years. Yeah, I think the freeze response, Jenny, is often forgotten about, and I'd say often in trauma, you see, where there's trauma, often you see the freeze response. And Peter Levine, in a book called Waking the Tiger on Trauma, which is a great book on trauma, talks about how in nature, when we're under threat, that kind of fighting or flighting is a necessary process to move the energy in the system, and the kind of freeze response needs to be unlocked. And a great example of the freeze response, if ever you have personal experience or seen somebody else, getting up to speak in public and not fighting, not flighting, just literally freezing. So that's another piece of it that's part of this reaction. Penny's saying, so true, identify with the subtype when I read about it in introductory pack, felt unsafe in childhood, many different carers, separation anxiety. Yeah, makes sense. Good. Well, look, thank you everyone for joining. A few other comments as well. Michaela's saying 20s that honest don't have the tools. Hopefully, Michaela, these live streams are at least providing some bits and pieces. Thank you, Anne. These live feeds are incredibly helpful. And Jenny, yeah, definitely check the book out. So I hope that's been useful. I look forward to talking with you again same time next week. Feel free to comment with any suggested topics, and I look forward to talking with you guys then. Thanks for watching.